Yes, can you see it?
Yes, it's fine. Please go ahead.
Well, great. Well, thank you very much for the kind introduction. First of all, it's a pleasure to be here, and good morning to all those presenting and participating from India. Good evening to them, good morning, and good afternoon to those joining from other places. So I will start just by highlighting why SRI 2030 decided to focus on rice crop. So that's because rice cover a consistent part of the global farmland, and there are around 1 billion people whose livelihood rely on rice value chain. Also, every day, rice feeds half of humanity, but we all know that there are some downsides to rice farming. First of all, rice greenhouse gas emission can be compared to that of the aviation sector. So that's quite relevant in global warming. And also rice really account for a disproportionate amount of water compared to that utilized by other fruit crops. And that's in a situation of growing water scarcity. So before proceeding further, let me just introduce what SRI 2030 is very briefly and where we come from. So all started from Project Drawdown. Project Drawdown is a bold initiative that compiled effective science-based climate solution and strategies to revert climate crisis. So that received quite a lot of attention during the past few years. And one of these ready-to-use solution is actually the system of rice intensification, SRI. So Project Drawdown did this calculation, and they come up with the fact that if SRI is scaled to 50 million hectares from the currently 7 to 9 million hectares, this will result in mitigating an important amount of greenhouse gases while also improving the livelihoods of rice farmers. And I will explain how this can happen together very soon. But before that, let me just say that the SRI 2030's goal is different from that of Project Drawdown. That's because we want to anticipate the timeline. So Project Drawdown was hoping to scale SRI to 50 million hectares by 2050. We think that we don't have all that time. We want to do it by 2030. And that's because we also think that that's achievable if there is appropriate support from the governments of rice-producing countries. So before proceeding further, I know that there are some people who know SRI actually very well, but let me just be sure that everyone is on the same page. So SRI is an agronomic strategy for managing rice cultivation. It reduced inputs, it enhanced the growth and the performance of rice plant while reducing greenhouse gas emission and improving water use efficiency and resilience against climate change. So that's because when its 4 principles are adopted, this creates the ideal condition for rice plants to develop their full genetic potential. Doesn't matter if they are hybrids or local varieties. This results in better plant development and especially the root system, as you can see from the picture there. So SRI is not really a fixed recipe for rice cultivation, but its principles need to be translated into practices that suit the given context. So the first principle are early and healthy plant establishment of single plants that can happen both by transplanting young seedlings or direct seeding of rice. Reducing plant density, as you can see from the picture up there, plants are usually planted according to a square pattern that can vary according to the context. Maintaining mostly aerobic soil condition, which is what influences greenhouse gas emission the most, and build up soil fertility. So SRI systems are really inclusive and can also be merged with other agroecological approaches like conservation agriculture and can be practiced both organically or with the use of synthetic inputs that in any way will be reduced. So to get closer to the topic, let me just say that NDCs, or National Determined Contribution, are actually at the heart of the Paris Agreement and at the heart of achieving the long-term goals of this agreement. So NDCs need to be submitted every 5 years from country. We are actually now going toward the next iteration that will be in 2025, will be the second iteration of NDCs. And they consist in a set of objectives for climate adaptation and mitigation for every sectors of country economies. So countries are actually legally obligated to have NDCs and to pursue measures with the aim of achieving these commitments. But the achievement of the commitments is not actually legally binding. So NDCs really represents a roadmap for states and can help states in deciding how to direct flow of funds and effort toward the achievement of specific goals. So among the 117 rice-producing countries in the world, only about 40 have rice-related commitments in their NDCs. So this is not very bad, I would say. It's actually a good starting point, but there is a lot that can be done to improve the situation. So in this table, I just highlighted the 10 major rice-producing countries. 3 of them, the 3 that you see highlighted in green, are actually including SRI in their NDCs. That means that they are committing to either reach a certain amount, a certain area under SRI type of management, or a certain amount of greenhouse gas emission mitigated through the implementation of SRI. Other countries in this table are having different types of strategies for sustainable rice in their NDCs. That's, for example, Thailand has some unspecified targets and strategies to mitigate rice-related emission. We have Bangladesh and Nigeria, who focus on adopting a specific water management, and I will come back just after in clarifying what that is. While Philippines actually doesn't have SRI specifically in its NDCs, but once SRI 2030 joined the International Rice Congress in Manila last week, we had the opportunity to actually speak with the Minister of Agriculture, who let us know that there is one document within the NDC that is mentioning SRI. So as you can see, it's not even always straightforward to understand what is countries' strategies to mitigate methane emission in the rice sector. But anyway, what this table really wants to show is that, again, the situation is not too bad. We have some of these countries that have strategies, but it's very evident that the 2 major rice-producing countries, which of course are also those that are emitting the most of the greenhouse gas emission from rice sector, are not having any rice-related commitments. So China and India together, they emit more than 40% of greenhouse gas emission from rice, but still don't have clear pathways to reduce this. So as you can see, there is some way for improvement, but here in this slide, actually, it's just highlighted what are countries' strategies. 4 are the main one. There is AWD, alternate wetting and dry, is the water management that I just referred to Bangladesh and Nigeria before, that consists in drying fields so that methane emission are reduced. So, SRI, we already mentioned what that is, but I want to clarify that under irrigated condition, AWD is the water management usually adopted by SRI farmers. Plus, we have some added benefit when SRI is implemented and not only AWD. Then we have direct seeding of rice, which also holds some potential for reducing GHG emission. And breeding new varieties is also something that countries are actually looking at for reducing at least the emission intensity by increasing yield. However, let's come to the point of why countries should focus on rice in their NDCs. So we saw rice importance in the global scale, but what about the actual mitigation? So I think this table clarified that quite well. On the left, we have the emission from agriculture sector. We see that rice is important, but not in compared to livestock or to the rest of cropland. But when we come to mitigation potential, that's quite relevant. And if we think about the relative mitigation potential, rice holds the greatest relative mitigation potential. So it's quite clear why countries and actually the subsector stakeholders are looking more and more on strategies to reduce greenhouse gas emission from rice, because it's more cost effective and more easier, let's say, than doing the same with other sectors within agriculture. Now let's finally come to the Alliance. The Alliance was established with the purpose of promoting meaningful collaboration and dialogue among member countries and organizations. So after only 3 months from the launch, that's very young initiative, the Alliance counts 10 member countries, 7 of which are from Africa, 2 from Asia, and 1 from South America. So countries are expected to collaborate with a network of experts for implementing their NDC commitments, for also accessing climate finance and engaging non-country stakeholders. Also, this is an opportunity to demonstrate best practices for rice-producing nations without NDC commitments, but who want to include in their next NDC iteration. And SRI 2030 role is also to focus mostly SRI system because of the various co-benefits. So we believe that really a coordinated effort between the various stakeholders, farmers, scientists, governments, NGOs, and private sector is actually the way for a just agroecological transition in the rice subsector. The 10 member countries at the moment are Togo, Benin, Cote d'Ivoire, Mali, Senegal, Kenya, Liberia, Uruguay, Vietnam, and Lao PDR. Among these, 2 of them, Kenya and Liberia, don't have rice-related NDC commitments, but are planning to include that in the next iteration. Now, probably you ask yourself, like, what has the NDC Alliance to do with power, inclusivity, and intersectionality? Well, power, if we think about power, for example, often countries that are often underrepresented in global discussion within the alliance become source of knowledge for other nations. A good example could be the one of Senegal, Togo, and Benin, which actually have precise quantification of their rice-related NDC commitments, and can be example for countries like Italy or Spain, which produce quite relevant amounts of rice, at least within Europe, but do not have any rice-related commitment. So you see, this changes the usual power dynamics between countries. Also, within the alliance itself, because of its fluid nature and the open access participation, each member country actually have the power to contribute to the trajectory of the alliance and its action and activities. So this empowers members in actually decide what will be the next step as an alliance. Also, since this is a self-funded initiative and is completely apolitical, there are no pressure from the outside on what the alliance should do. So our role as SRI 2030 is just really as a convener, bringing more members, bringing more stakeholders, and facilitate connection, as well as highlight the opportunity that SRI specifically brings. That's because that's our expertise and the expertise of our network. So regarding inclusivity and intersectionality, well, the alliance, of course, is quite a high-level discussion, but when we think about rice, we always have to remember that 90% of rice produced around the world is by resource-poor smallholder farmers, and 80% of the labor force is women. So, as I was saying, even these are quite high-level discussion. When countries actually plan to sustainably intensify their rice production, they always have to take into account who is working on the field and how to actually make it successful by involving these people. So the reason why we push for SRI specifically is because this is an inclusive agroecological approach, which is particularly easy for smallholder farmers because it's not really input intensive, but it's knowledge intensive. And also it's well documented that women enjoy the most SRI because being the most of the labor force and carrying out most of the drudgery of this work, this method actually support a better livelihood for women first. Also, yes, SRI is an open access innovation, so it's not patented, so everyone can use it. So let's say the reason why we are pushing for that is because we think that countries, if they adopt a certain type of practice, then the strategy should be more inclusive. And that's the case for agroecology, when put in front of, for example, breeding new rice.
Francesco, sorry to interrupt. Can you wind up in a minute or so?
Sure. I have just the last the last slide. So yes, as I was saying, SRI can be used also with improved varieties, but the issue is to adopt agroecology, which is more inclusive than just breeding new expensive varieties, and that's it. So to conclude, I just want to say that although power, inclusivity, intersectionality are usually addressed at the project level, rightfully so, because that's actually where action and human interaction happen, we think that to achieve a timely and just transition toward a more sustainable type of agriculture, governments should collaborate among each other, share knowledge and learn from different but often relatable experiences. So it's only by adopting high-level strategies for mainstreaming inclusive approach like SRI that this can translate into project that takes into account the type of transition we are all hoping and working for. And that's particularly true and important for a crop that is key to the global food security and to the livelihoods of some of the most marginalized people in the world. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Francesco, for a brief but very interesting presentation. You've given an international perspective on places we don't hear much about, especially in Africa, and there's something interesting happening there which probably other nations could learn from. Just a quick clarificatory question. I think your presentation also draws and connects with other kinds of themes which we will discuss. One is how do you value agroecology, and as well as state capacity and policy. So there are, parallel kinds of connections that one can make. But just for us to understand better, what's the position of India on NDC? You have any, is it really binding? Governments willing to make that commitment, or how does it work?
So India currently doesn't have any rice-related commitments in its NDCs, and that's because, let's say, the official reason is that rice is so important for Indian food security that they don't want to include it in some strategies that are related not to food security but to climate mitigation. So that's the official reason why India, for now, is refusing to have rice-related NDC commitments. But it's clear, and you know as well, that when strategies like SRI are adopted, you have both sides of this. You have climate mitigation and also enhanced food security because of increased yield. So that's the reason why we're pushing for this specific approach, because we think that once policymakers understand that thinking about the environment doesn't mean not to care about food security, then they will adopt high-level strategies to disseminate agroecology.
Yeah, thanks, Francesco, for clarifying that. And I think Shilpa has a comment here, and I'm just reading it out. On the inclusive nature of SRI, the way you defined it, my experience has been a bit different. It enhances women's workload, and hence there are less farmers who continue with SRI for longer time. So there is a bit of disadoption. So would love to know your experience.
Sure. Well, my experience actually doesn't come from the on-field experience, because although I'm surrounded by rice here in Italy, there is not much SRI or manual rice, but it comes from the collective experience of our network around the world. It is very true that at the beginning SRI is somehow labor intensive, but that's because this is not a solution like applying more fertilizer or using this new seed. It is a knowledge intensive process. So at the beginning there is maybe 1 or 2 years where farmers need to learn about these principles and how to translate into contextual practices, and that require some more work. But it's also true that once SRI principle and practices are learned and adapted, then the amount of work is reduced. Of course, some type of mechanization always help to reduce labor intensity, but it's really about understanding and implementing the practices well. That's why some successful projects and program around India as well, they always have at least 3 years of extension service with farmers, because that's the time frame when farmers actually need to be followed by extension workers. And after that, they're actually autonomous. If they're not followed well, you are right. There may be disadoption because they didn't, they weren't followed enough to learn the practice, the principle, and to adapt this principle to their context.
Thanks a lot, Francesco. I think there are a few other questions, and my suggestion might be that you can try and address them, answer them live or on chat. I see that many of the people who have joined are conference participants, and I just like to say that we will have an opportunity to discuss this physically. Shilpa and Devahuti, Sabarmati is coming as one of the panels, and she has a lot to say on gender and SRI. That's part of her PhD work. And we also have Kapil Shah here, who is undertaking a fairly big experiment on the system of mustard intensification across different locations in India. We may have some interesting results coming up in a few months. So all these conversations, I'm sure, can be carried on further. Ankit, I think if you don't have an answer right now, we'll discuss this as and when we do have an opportunity. So, Francesco, please go ahead and continue responding to the queries in the chat and the, in the question answer. I'd like to now move to our next speaker and invite Alexa Russo. Alexa, welcome back to IRMA. You were here last year physically for the Strategic Management Forum conference, where we did talk about, farmer producer companies, but I think your work is looking at the intersectionality of gender, sustainable agriculture, and producer collectives. So over to you. Alexa is pursuing her PhD at the Stanford University, and she will talk to us about some of the intermediate outcomes of her work.
Great. Thanks, Shambhu. And also thank you, Shambhu, for inviting me to present today, and also for providing this accommodating space, virtual venue for those of us who couldn't make it to the conference, unfortunately. So as Shambhu was saying, I'm in the midst of writing my dissertation right now. I just completed 15 months of fieldwork in India, and my dissertation is in anthropology, which, as many of you may know, takes ethnography as its primary mode of methodological inquiry. I say this as a bit of a disclosure because I'll be reading a bit, kind of an excerpt from what will be a chapter of mine. And in anthropology, we kind of write starting with stories and then see where it leads us, what kind of arguments, what kind of conclusions. And so right now in this sort of draft form, it's very story-based. You'll kind of see the kind of arguments forming, and happy to talk about that further. And I think actually after all the comments coming up in the previous presentation, the questions that are arising are actually very relevant, I'm finding, to what you'll see in my presentation as well. So to situate you all a bit in my work, my research is looking at an NGO's sustainable agriculture program in Madhya Pradesh, and the NGO's all-women's producer company that largely consists of Adivasi women. And this producer company markets the sustainable agriculture products. This particular chapter focuses on how farmers, particularly women farmers, how they imagine their own futures and how they collectively remember their past, and what this all means for their relationship with sustainable agriculture. This particular excerpt is focusing on more the collective past side, but you'll hear bits of their aspirations, their relationship to the NGO's work a bit throughout, but it's part of a larger sort of argument and story as well. So now to situate you a bit in the story right now, you are now in a farmer group meeting on sustainable agriculture. Before you could walk with your bare feet on your field. Now you can't weed barefoot. Now the situation is that the land has become hard, meaning you have to wear shoes. This means the land is going bad. This was Anand, the NGO's local resource person, or LRP, for agriculture in this specific area. He had already gone through a number of sustainable agriculture techniques in the meeting before now turning to the topic at hand. What did people used to do? They didn't put anything on their fields. It was healthy, Anand explained. We benefit from Jaivik Kheti, that is sustainable agriculture. We get to eat pure foods. Second is the land doesn't go bad. Third is we don't need to give money for a doctor. Expenses go down. If we don't do this in the coming years, 10 years from now, the land will become completely hard. We are in such a situation that there's a train from Punjab to Rajasthan called the cancer train. This means that over there, they use too many pesticides. So the situation, the land has gotten really bad. There's been a lot of sicknesses. Here we have time to take care. The past was a continually invoked concept in these farmer meetings. As these meetings have been going on for several years, over a decade in many cases, they seem to be just as much about reminding farmers of the practices as invoking a certain feeling, a nostalgic loss for a time that once was. Many of the women were middle-aged or older, but the oldest, only the oldest, had fully experienced a life before these changes. However, the majority had witnessed some of the agrarian transformations over the past few decades, that is, after water had arrived, recalling how life was in their childhoods. Yet, more often than not, it was a vicarious nostalgia, passed down lore from their parents, grandparents, and in-laws. Testing the farmers with some questions on the practice, and then was unsatisfied with the answers he got from the room. He smiled. So everyone understands, but so few do it. The women started talking and laughing amongst themselves. The woman next to Anand clarified, what they're trying to say is they don't want to put in the work, the minute. If it takes money, it'll take money, but they don't want to do the work at home. They don't want to put in the work, Anand repeated, shaking his head. Today's farmers do not work hard, was a common lamentation from most anyone trying to promote sustainable agriculture, or even in general reflections about farmers these days. Today's farmers are alsi, they're lazy. They simply do not want to put in the effort. Over and over again, Govind, another agriculture LRP, would inform farmers as to what kind of practices they should do, telling that the minute was worth it, and praising the farmers he saw doing hard work. During one such occasion, Govind, pointing to the farmers, exclaimed, "This is the kind of work you need to do." But in exasperation, he added, "But farmers would rather just buy charamar, the weedicide, from the store and hire a tractor and be done with it." Curious about this past that was often spoken about, I asked Suresh at a later date, "So what was it like back then?" Suresh was quite frank. "If you look at the condition before," he said, "it was quite bad." Suresh was one of those lifer employees who had been with the NGO from near the beginning. While involved in many projects simultaneously, he was often at farmer group meetings, charismatically integrating technique explanation with evocations of the past. But one thing you would never hear from LRPs like Suresh was that the past was something beautiful to return to, in any sort of complete sense of the word, at least. Suresh, as someone perhaps beyond middle age, but not in the realm of what people might call old people, had only partial first-hand knowledge of these old times. To begin with the general story, as told by many Adivasi farmers in the area, before less than 100 years ago, there had been no one in that area. The area had been completely forested with trees, many of which were cut down by parents and grandparents of the current villagers. Post-independence, the government invited many communities to come and transform the forest into agricultural land, which would then become theirs for barely any money. It is well known that the Sirvi caste community, the dominant caste, came first, coming from Rajasthan, taking the best land, quality and location-wise, and the most of it. Adivasis from nearby districts were soon to follow, and in some instances even rival the Sirvi caste in terms of the amount of land. Farmers spoke of this era as a time when land was plentiful, unlike now. One simply cut down more forests to get more land. The act itself of felling trees was enough, older farmers would tell me, to claim this land. But the abundance of land was one of the few things that older farmers would fondly speak of when it came to these old times. Everything else in terms of resources and access was worse. Back then it rained so much, often destroying the crops. There were so many animals at that time from nearby forests that they would come to the fields and eat the crops. The animals were also dangerous to the farmers themselves. There were no towns nearby, so for any store-bought items or medication, people would, often on foot, go all the way up to the steep plateau to the nearest town. The situation was so dire, elder farmers would speak of many people, especially children, dying. Some attribute this to not growing enough grain, others to the lack of vaccines with diseases such as polio prevalent at the time. As soon as you would have a nukta, that is a death ritual for one woman told me, you would have another nukta for another person. It was that bad. Sometimes there was be one person left in a family. Many farmers simply packed up their bags and moved back to where they came from. They had come because land had been scarce back there, but this was worse. Yet there were positives to the past. Many farmers were free of work from the end of the Kharif harvest after laboring on large farmers' land to the Kharif sowing season. This period of 4 to 5 months was a period of what they called time pass, when they would visit with friends and relatives, oftentimes for days and weeks at a time. Older farmers would tell me that that time functioned differently back then. Once harvest was over, there was no work one had to do and nothing pulling on you, taking you away from those you were with. This was often put in direct contrast to the way time works today in a world where time is very kimti or valuable. Older farmers, villagers would often point to Govind, who would sometimes accompany me on these home visits, as an example of how kimti time had become. He must be in the office at 9 a.m. and cannot simply take his time in the villages. While these recountings were steeped in nostalgia, as no one I spoke to had any interest in returning to this time. While these farmers spoke wistfully of a time when people would help each other, they were very adamant that this time was terrible. There are so many more resources nowadays. Most importantly, there was water that allowed them to grow crops for 2 seasons, sometimes 3, and new types of crops that were more productive. It seemed to be a worthwhile exchange for them, time and mutual support for resources and prosperity. Yes, there was a loss, but they had gained so much. And this mutual support, this madad, was common back in those days because they had to help each other. In such a dire situation, they had few other options. So while these farmers spoke of a sort of bhavana, as I said, a sort of feeling of kindness and care between them, they were highly aware and critical of the desperate situation in which this bhavana was produced. In fact, it was much more likely that those a bit younger who accompanied me would now and then chime in about what they had heard. They were the ones who had waxed poetic about these times that they had never lived through. They had not had the full experience of those hardships, but they had felt the ache of what was missing from the present. Older farmers also had an ambivalence when it came to this Meneti Kisan, this hardworking farmer of the past. On one hand, these farmers spoke of those in the past, those who toiled for long hours on their fields with a touch of pride and respect for their forebears and some themselves who put in that much time and so much work into their fields. Farmers would say how both farmers and land were strong during those times due to the lack of chemicals and nourishing benefits of superfood staples like jowar, the millet in the area. Farmers back then also had the adat, the habit of working hard. But this was not a sort of minutes, kind of hard work that anyone wished to recreate. Its farmers had to do that work. And while they were able to survive, from today's generation's perspective, they were not able to do much more than that. As became evident in many of the brief references of the past, the change in minutes over the years look very different for men and women. Everyone acknowledged that labor requirements diminish over decades for both, but they change in different ways and to a different extent. Men's labor had largely diminished due to machinery, in particular tractors for plowing and sowing. Machines greatly reduced women's work within the home. Yet, as Sangeeta Didi contemplated after spending several hours weeding, women's labor in the fields had not diminished nearly as much as men's. It was in fact chemicals such as weedicide that decreased women's weeding work and pesticides that diminished women's work of applying homemade products. But often these chemical inputs, less so than the machinery, were forgone by small farmers in attempts to save money, meaning that women continued to perform much of this labor. The selfishness of the current age was also unevenly embodied across genders. While elderly farmers, both women and men, would often say lines such as, "Today everyone is selfish." When they would break it down to exactly who is selfish, it would be hard for these farmers to place women in that category. Women and men in the villages were quite clear that women did more seva, that is selfless giving. So in addition to child-rearing responsibilities, there are plenty of everyday situations where this would show up. As Anju Didi explained, women have to take out time for other people. She gives the example of her husband's sister and the sister-in-law's husband who had just stopped by from Indore. They came to her for seva, for food, and as she said, good talk, not her husband. Women would sometimes not want to entertain all these guests, but what could they do? Simi Didi had told me over chai later. Husbands sometimes want to bring guests home and their wives were then compelled to feed these people and take care of their needs, whatever the hour. Women were also much more likely to engage in arzi-parzi relationships, that they say, relationships of labor exchange, where women would, as I say, help each other on each other's fields. Excluded from many labor markets, these non-monetary exchanges would often take place within the village. Adivasi women also spoke of seva and madad as something poor, and particularly Adivasi people were more likely to do. The Sirvi caste, they may be smart, hoshiar, and aware, jagruk, but they did not help people much. Adivasis of their own accord, from their heart, as I would say, manse, would help other people. But even among Adivasis, family members were attuned to how wealth changed people. Anju Didi noted that the sister-in-law walked right past the house of the other brother, who had more money and was less likely to show hospitality. Adivasis had particular words for these people, both within their communities, but particularly OBC ones. Kanjus, stingy, was a particular common one. The village runs on seva, Sima Didi told me. People should not act this way. While Adivasi communities stressed the dramatic changes since those before times, it was really women's labor, poor Adivasi women's labor, that was most tied to this past, particularly what was good about it. It was Adivasi women who continued to help people who were supposed to help people. Yet for Adivasis in this area, these associations were not related to some authentic essence of being a woman or Adivasi, but were situated in historical label transformations and gendered expectations and exclusions. So seeing just these good associations would require one take a sort of amnesia-like stance toward all those hardships of the past. And while these associations and daily life in villages do exist, they are deeply complicated and oftentimes overwhelmed by the myriad of other negative associations the past brought up. Therefore, many of the LRPs who had been steeped in the NGO's work for decades, but were locals existing in a world in which these histories were very much alive, would often qualify ideas of returning to the past. There should be developments, Suresh is clear, but the knowledge of nature, what he called prakritik gyan, that is being lost. They should go together, the traditional things and the technical. They should create a balance. The old things, these purani chize, are going down and the technical things are on the rise. So one day the old will be completely lost. There should be a balance between the two. While Prakritik Gyan refers here more specifically perhaps to the older sustainable agriculture practices, in words like Purani Chize, these old things, Suresh was alluding to much more than agriculture. One must take what was good from the past, sustainable practices, knowledges, ways of relating, and mix it with what is good in the present. Women in Adivasi communities were therefore these ideal actors, both symbolically and through their labor, to bring about this balance. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alexa. From a global kind of perspective, you've taken us to the fields of Madhya Pradesh and given some fascinating accounts of what's happening in the field there. How do the men see things and the women see things? So I'll just start with a clarificatory question. So you said this is part of your chapter that you're writing up. So what's the title of the chapter?
That perhaps is not decided yet, but it will be something along the lines of convincing the farmer and aspirations and collective histories while doing the hard work of sustainable agriculture. I'm trying to bring together both how people convince the farmer, how this kind of connects with their collective understandings of history and their own aspirations, which I'll go into more detail on, and how this all connects to the question of hard work. And so I think this relates to the previous presentation, is that there is a continual question, what do you do with the difficult word of sustainable agriculture and how this is gendered as well. So bringing all those together and seeing, okay, what does this mean for transformation in the fields, and also for the way power structures all this, and how women's roles are critical, but also a bit instrumentalized.
Yeah, so just to understand a bit better, your account starts off with stories of Anand, Sanjay, and many male farmers who are saying either things aren't quite the same, people are lazy. I mean, the lazy part refers almost to a common statement which happens in rice. Rice is a lazy man's crop and so on. But just wondering whether you can elaborate the difference between the understanding of Sanjay, Anand, and others, and how do they look at this whole issue of sustainable agriculture versus the Adivasi women you talked about, Anju and others? Are they distinctly different? How does this element of seva fit into these kinds of structures. So some thoughts on it?
Yeah, no, I think I will be fleshing this out more, but to give you some sort of answer now. So those are the LRPs. And so one of the kind of other gender dynamics is the fact that the NGO is largely, as many NGOs are run by men, and largely are the workers are men, and the women are the ones that they are teaching. And so those in the NGO are more likely to have this kind of perspective, you can say, of this sort of, there's a bit of a kind of moralizing perspective about these people should be working harder. But I think it's complicated because all these men are also farmers. So they're kind of part-time farmers as well. And so they actually, I think I couldn't get the nuance in here as much because of timing, but they sympathize with the farmers. And they talk about how it's how difficult it is, and they understand that these aspirations, which I didn't go into in much detail, these aspirations, which often take people away from the farm, actually do require a lot of minutes. They actually do require a lot of work, and so they understand that oftentimes farmers are kind of swapping one form of minute for another. They would rather do the hard work of getting off the farm rather than on the farm. But they also, I think these LRPs are actually also really committed, at least the ones that I spoke to this is not just some sort of top-down, I don't believe in this, but I will try to convince farmers anyway. They know that it's harming the fields. And I think the farmers do as well. And so this is not to present also the NGO as, being the one with all the kind of, the only one who wants sustainable agriculture, the only one who realizes all the bad things going on. The farmers do as well, but they're caught in so many other factors, including the question of working really hard. And so I think there's that kind of complicating feature as well. And so these LRPs are sort of in the midst of trying to negotiate all this, both through the sort of moralizing discourse, but also try to sympathize with the farmer as well. And I think that also is a gendered component, when they say all the work that's being done, especially because these are NGO workers, they don't spend all their days in the fields. They go on their kind of weekends when they have time in the mornings. Usually it is their female family members who are the ones doing most of the work. So there is that dynamic that, even though they know this is a type of work that is hard, they are not doing as much of it as perhaps their female family members as well. So a little easier to try to convince others to do it. But I have all the sympathies for this sort of work that they're doing as well.
Yeah, so there is a question by Pushkar. I think it has to do with these. What's the status of implementation of the Forest Rights Act in the region that you talk about? Was that something that you came across in your study, or it was kind of marginal to what you did?
It's something I need to investigate further. I really focus on the ethnographic component of the farmers who were not up to speed on that. I know there are those in the NGO who have been wanting to work on that more closely. And so I cannot answer this directly. I can more tell you how the relationship with those in the villages with the forest, because what basically, to elaborate a little bit further, what happened is there was, and this is not actually the Forest Rights Act perhaps, but exclusions from the forest that were happening that have, there's this sort of relationship between, are you using for farming, or are we using it for getting forest products? And so Adivasis in the area have been living it out on both ends. And so it's not, it's from my understanding, although if there's, I even know there might be someone on the call who might even know better than me, this isn't something that's been actively taken up by the NGO, but it's been talked about and anticipated. But it's not like an active sort of movement going on in this area, but one that has, I think, potential, given the fact there is still a lot of forest there, and there could be room for that sort of work.
One question which I'd like you to think about, you don't need to probably respond to it completely right now, is is a tempting question, which I suppose Deborah will answer slightly differently. Is there a clear distinction in the way men look at sustainable agriculture vis-a-vis women look at sustainable agriculture? Or is it premature to make this kind of statement? You seem to allude to the fact that they're able to bring in concepts of seva and other kinds of things. The nature of work is very different in the way it's done. And I'm kind of reminded in some sense of a conversation that happened in SRI in Uttarakhand. This whole idea that once they brought these weeders, what was a gendered operation became actually something that, men started doing weeding. Women used to do weeding earlier. And women in Uttarakhand actually ended up using this as a negotiating space. It's not that they could run the weeders, but they said, this is an opportunity for us to get the men back to the field. So there's a certain kind of interplay between how gender is understood. So I was wondering whether you have some quick thoughts, so you can get back to this a bit later. So is there any clear distinction between what men look at and women look at in agriculture? And
I think it is a really interesting question, and one that I'm hoping to explore more. I think like this something also to note is that there's different people are paid for different types of work in the field, and weeding is like one of the lowest paying types of work if you are getting laborers, and they're mainly women. So the idea of getting men to do more weeding when they have other opportunities for other forms of labor, and I'm not sure how that would work, at least where I'm looking. But in terms of their relation with sustainable agriculture, I actually have this whole section that I'm happy to share at a later date, and especially as I elaborate on it more. But I do think there's an interplay between women's traditional roles and how sustainable agriculture programs are using those roles to draw women in to those practices. And I think given where women are situated, particularly poorer women, smallholder farmers, it's actually much more easier to do that than it is for men. And I think like there's almost like an uncannily similar sort of process that I'm seeing as what happened with SHGs. In a lot of places I've heard of about how they used to have men's SHGs, but then it didn't quite work out very well. And so women were much better. And so, of course, a lot of feminists question, like, what does that mean to have women be better? It's using a lot of kind of, using the kind of things that limit women for them to be better credit holders. They're not as mobile as men. They have certain sort of responsibilities to the home. So there's all sorts of ways that's an issue, but it also has done other things. And I don't want to just say that SHGs have just been bad for women, but it is a complex way where there's an interplay with very kind of gendered expectations. And so women become these sort of, as we would say, subjects of development much more in a lot of spaces than men. I think similarly, sustainable agriculture has a bit of that. Women are already part of all these institutions through these women's empowerment programs. They're used to going to meetings with the SHGs. It's very natural to just move it to sustainable agriculture. But I think also, in addition to that, there's also some very specific things about sustainable agriculture that make it more amenable to women and their roles. And I think this has like a number of fronts. One is a lot of these male LRPs will talk about the ways that they'll talk about nutrition, and women will get it more. They will be more invested in the nutrition of their family. Now, some people will say, this is great, wonderful, let's bring women on. Some people say, wow, that's really reinscribing women into the household. But it is something that has been talked about as something that women are more, say, great, that's something that we want to do because we're invested in the future of our children. There's a way I think that actually thinking about the future and future of one's family is also very gendered female in ways that sustainability really draws on as well, sustainable agriculture more specifically. Of course, there's a whole larger gendered idea of women being better listeners, and again, very mixed and enmeshed in all sorts of genderings of expectations. But specifically, I think also what's interesting is sustainable agriculture is really dependent on less on increased production, although that's always appreciated if it happens, but more on decrease of expenditure. And the kind of argument that I'm trying to make is that there's a binary that happens between women in the home and men in the market, right? That is something, of course, I'm really invested in as a feminist, but what that also means is men are also sometimes more associated with cash crops and having higher incomes. They also have higher income capacities, whereas women are a lot of times in charge of expenses. And so what they do oftentimes is decrease expenditures is actually part of women's roles. And so this, I will be arguing this is actually part, it in some ways makes sense for women a lot of times because if decrease expenditures, we want to do that. Whereas men are just very much, at least as told by me, interested in increase of income, less so in this decrease of expenditure. So those are some of the points. There's so many interesting ones. Those are the ones that Tom talked to come to the top of my head.
Thank you so much, Alexa. There's a question by Abhishek, a very interesting question, but I would encourage you to take it up online and we'll move on to the next presentation. If you have time, we can come back to that. And please do respond to the question just for the interests of everyone. The question is, do you think the women who are the board members of the producer collective think differently about drudgery and sustainable agriculture and seva as compared to other women farmers? So thanks a lot, Alexa, for bringing in a lot of nuance in what happens in the fields of Madhya Pradesh. We'll now move on to Deborah's presentation, where she's exploring this idea of gender in producer companies. Again, somewhat similar in asking this question: do women think about the markets differently from men? Over to you, Deborah. Deborah is currently based in Carolina. She, she continues to be associated with IRMA Small Farm Income Team. And yeah, over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Professor Shambhu. So, and thanks for the fascinating account, Alexa. I think, I mean, if one were to summarize, the answer is it's all very complicated with so many enmeshed concerns and trade-offs that continuously happen. And in this presentation also, I'll be briefly touching upon the various factors that seem to impact whether women farmer producer organizations can also be intermediaries of sustainable transitions. So the slides are visible, right? Okay, I'm assuming that the slides are visible.
Yes, Deborah.
Yeah. Okay, right. As mentioned, more than 80% of women are employed in the agricultural sector, and the rural female workforce comprises largely of agrarian work. Even though this is the case, their land holdings are at a mere 14%. And there is limited access to various resources and opportunities through discriminative social norms and laws, because of which women are not able to fully demonstrate their capability to contribute to rural development. And there are various studies which show how they're less likely to have access to digital technologies. And as such, then we see social inequalities getting manifested into digital inequalities, and also then sort of increasing the economic disparities. So this sort of translates into the registrations of FPOs, where because of land holdings not being in their name, they need to get an NOC, which needs to be signed by the male farmer. And so there are all these legal steps that make it more difficult for women to be represented. And while this is happening, we also see what is known as feminization in agriculture, where there is increased participation of women, but despite this increased participation, they have limited role in agricultural decision-making and have low representation in market-facing roles with little control over price realization of farm commodities. So having women, however, is not just a question of social equity and empowerment, because what has been shown is that women are also committed to their business. If given a chance, the proportion of women entrepreneurs using their savings for business purposes increased from 53% to 78% between 2017 and 2020. Women tend to stay in business, and the average rate of business discontinuance is about 10% lower. And as mentioned earlier, women are also strong savers and prudent borrowers, and they have a lower rate of non-performing loans than men. Again, for the reasons are obviously more complicated, but having women on board also makes good business sense. So with these findings, it would also seem that in recent years, there is an increased support and attention being paid to the development of women-led enterprises. And recently, for instance, Walmart Foundation has invested nearly 39 million to reach 500 farmer producer organizations. And there seems to be a lot of talk about supporting and nurturing women-led FPOs. However, and while there are reasons to celebrate this increased attention, one might want to be cautiously optimistic, because we also need to see similar changes happening at the level of policy making, because while there has been a push for the FPOs, researchers have already commented that there is no criteria for the minimum number of women shareholders required in a mixed FPO, or there is insufficient clarity on the minimum number of women FPOs to be formed in the first place. Without adequate capacity building and ecosystem support, then the requirements such as, the FPO board of directors to have at least one female on board becomes more like an empty gesture. And what needs to be understood is that the mere availability of an opportunity, such as forming an FPO, does not always translate into equitable participation, because women do face additional resource constraints and have to negotiate patriarchal norms. So understanding these ground level initiatives focused on supporting and enabling women-led FPOs might offer some insights for designing policy recommendations. So there is a need to document and recognize these added dimensions of socioeconomic complexities governing women's participation in male-dominated markets. And this brings us to the sustainability question, that are women-led FPOs better equipped to lead transition initiatives? Because it's amply clear that there are these high ecological costs of conventional agriculture. And there has been a lot of discussion about whether FPOs can support the transition to sustainable agriculture, or they're likely to become a mechanism for promoting agricultural models based on the last mile delivery of agrochemical inputs, and or whether FPOs can get their members more involved in sustainable agricultural practices, or will their outreach mechanism be appropriated by business as usual corporate interests? And within these questions, is there a possibility that the increased participation of women can broaden and deepen the multiple goals of organic and sustainable farming? So with some of these questions, we tried characterizing some women-led FPOs, and this was part of a larger project where there were 15 case studies of FPOs that were conducted, and it was a unique participatory approach involving collaboration between academics and practitioners to identify the management processes. And these FPOs were in rain-fed areas with a minimum of 3 years of operations. And for those interested, this is The findings have been presented in the form of a book, of which 2 chapters are open access. So these women-led FPOs, as you can see, the oldest was established as early as 2009 and the youngest in 2016. There is a lot of variation in the number of shareholders, with the largest having more than 360 SHGs, and you can also see that the commodities that they have been handling are varied, and there are diverse products that they have been engaging with. When it comes to business performance, and it is not unexpected that there have been, most of these FPOs saw modest and fluctuating profits. Mahila Umang and KBS were profitable in all years except one, whereas Hasnabad and Jivika saw more loss years than profit. And these kind of fluctuations are again dependent on there are various factors. There was obviously the pandemic, and before that there are these fluctuating prices in the market that impact the revenue and the profit. What was also seen is that the promoting organizations have seemed to play a crucial role in setting the long-term vision of the FPOs, because the values and mobilization efforts play a role in achieving critical stability, and whether the FPO is maintaining a focus on financial and ecological sustainability. So for instance, we saw SPS and their commitment to ecologically responsible initiatives in the case of Ram Rahim sort of played this role in gradually sort of moving away from soybean cultivation in the area. And as they saw that it was a risky crop, and it was also incompatible with the core values of non-pesticidal management that they had been working on for many years. And they have been shifting to growing native crops like chana, jawar, and wheat. Organizations such as Pradhan and Grassroots have also had a lot of focus on diversifying their cropping patterns and focusing more on the stability rather than growth. And these notions then also percolate into the decision making of the respective FPOs. In case of Pandana, Pandana's promoting organization AKRSP organized large number of women into SHGs for financial inclusion, better agriculture and livestock practices in early days, as they recognized the intimate knowledge that the women had about the livestock practices, and wanted to include them in meaningful ways. In contrast, we see for an FPO like Hasnabad, the promoting organization, while they were very much focused on gender equity, there was not enough of mobilization effort that had happened before. And in a hurry to sort of, let's say, get into, reach profits, they over-relied on a single crop and the MSP prices for the same, which kind of backfired, and they ended up making a lot of losses over time. So what we see is that for these FPOs, most of them have leveraged pre-existing SHG movements to mobilize women, and they have been aiming for steady growth rather than risky trajectories. So, for instance, Jivika and Mahila Umang had managed to have steady revenues through cautious investments, therefore allowing the members to develop business acumen through taking smaller risks and having almost like conducting some sort of pilot studies. And similarly, depending on the context, for instance, for the FPOs in in remote hills or tribal areas such as Uttarakhand and Jharkhand, They try to adapt the FPOs through creating a stable community of shareholders rather than sort of aiming for high growth and then falling into the trap of fluctuating revenues. So there are these cohesive units which are formed. There have also been attempts for inclusive participation, such that, for instance, in Umang Mahila, 70% of the staff and the MD are women, and in some other FPOs, such as KBSSL, men have also been co-opted or they have been encouraged to support women as equal members, and they have acknowledged that these are actually cultural shifts which take time, and in the interim they have relied on having male CEOs who are chosen by the women BODs to actually help them negotiate better with the market and so on. So
another couple of minutes.
Yeah, I'll be wrapping up soon. Promoting institutions might be better advised to undertake gender analysis even before forming the FPO, as was the case with Pandana. So, for instance, they were able to change the strategy from mixed groups to formation of exclusive women Pashupalak Samoos, and that helped them leverage the aptitude and knowledge of tribal women. And as a contrast case, Hasnabad suggests the importance of the need to build a basic support system before attempting ambitious social change initiatives. So what we see is that that acknowledging and supporting women's participation, while it is needed, it is a normative shift and not just a technical change in a technical criteria. So it needs sensitization of women and empowerment of sensitization of men and empowerment of women. And there is need for intersectional inclusion as well, because this is happening across various several levels, and these parameters for inclusion include class, caste, and gender representation across various levels of the organization. There is a need to build leadership and not just have them as women farmers, because there is their role and participation in internal decision making is important. And these organizations can also learn from more mature organizations who have sort of learned to balance the various trade-offs and with other core aims such as financial performance, strong leadership, and smooth governance. So while FPOs have the potential to be inclusive and sustainable, there is a long way to go for enabling women participation in governance and decision making. So while there is need for formal procedures for increased representation, but they are inadequate in themselves to direct the change that is needed, and that is something that will take time. So having more resources does not automatically mean having more agency or voice. So there is an increased focus. There's need for increased focus on nurturing women-led FPOs without falling into the trap of getting co-opted within the mainstream business as usual market models. And that brings us to the need for having different metrics to assess the functioning and health of FPOs through focus on sustainability parameters, social changes, nutrition, and well-being of farmer members. So going forward, I think these studies suggest the need for strengthening women's participation, supporting their existing roles, providing women with platforms and financial means to negotiate the markets, and creating learning alliances between civil society organizations, policymakers, and farmers to design relevant ecosystems for inclusion of women. Yeah, I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Deborah, and to Alexa and Francesco as well for some very fascinating conversations. So, Deborah, I think in terms of the way we look at FPOs, I think there's a lot of discussion nowadays on trying to have many women-led FPOs in the natural farming, or how do we create natural farming FPOs? I think there's been a interest from the government of India as well. And what it seems to suggest you know that from your work that you presented today, that there are many, many nuances to it that one should look at. And, you know, having these cases from across regions and time is indeed very helpful. So, yeah, so Anish has got a question. So I think his question is, could you clarify how do the women-only FPOs and women-led manage to overcome the structural constraints that you mentioned in the initial part of the presentation? For instance, even the registration of FPOs.
Yeah, should I answer in the chat or?
No, please do.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, so because of this, the promoting organizations here have a big role to play in seeing to it that the compliances were in place, and in some cases, for instance, if the husband has the land, then you know, there are like certain processes that need to be followed for them to be able to join formally, and these have been enabled by the promoting organizations. And it is, again, I mean, this is something that takes time, and the question is whether you know, there is enough acknowledgement of all these you know, structural constraints and the time it takes to sort of at least have everything in place for the registration to happen. So that is what is being sort of questioned, and there needs to be like enough acknowledgement and time given for these things to happen. Yeah.
Yeah, so I think there's a related question from Shilpa, which you can probably respond to. I think, so Shilpa says, I'm glad you studied these women-led FPOs. Any other gender barriers that they face, and how have they overcome this, apart from registration, which you referred to?
I think Shilpa would be able to answer this better than me, but I mean, like the cases, they what I realized, at least, you know, there are such diverse contexts, and in some cases it could be just the access to markets, and you know, while it, and in the case of Jivika, for example, they tried you know, online trading, and then they moved away from that for again, different, there were various reasons. But understanding, I think, you know, market negotiation and what works in different contexts, it may not be the same as what may work for let's say a mixed FPO or a men-led FPO. So we saw those comparative, I mean, I haven't discussed the mixed FPOs or the other FPOs which were largely men, because they, again, I mean, the business decisions that they were able to take were different, and because you know, there are certain maybe access that we otherwise tend to take for granted, which was not the case for the women FPOs, and then they have to think of different strategies. So those are I mean, not exactly barriers, but that is the kind of, I think, context sensitivity that leads to different you know, pathways being more salient, and those need to be again, I mean, understood better, or more supportive ecosystems need to be provided for those options to be available. So
thanks, Deborah. There's another question from Sudhi Sheshadri, and he says, would it be helpful to know women-led FPOs go beyond sensitizing women and empowering women in replaceable exploitative mechanisms in market? I'm sure they do so in fundamental ways. Did you come across such evidence, or it was beyond the scope of your study?
I think one would have to go to this individual the cases studied in more detail to sort of identify these points. I mean, I think another thing is that these are not like you know, overnight shifts. I mean, these are like these gradual changes which are happening, whether it is slowly forming a community which is having some say in the local market, and then going on and sort of changing certain parameters over time. So those are, I think, longitudinal studies in that case are become very important, because we tend to look at these major shifts, but then there are a lot of I think social, cultural, and economic changes that are happening in the background, which are enabling or constraining what the women FPOs are able to do. So
yeah, Sudhi Seshadri, I think we might want to share with you a blog written by Shilpa, who's here, and Naveen, about the Pandana FPO, and how once women got involved, they actually preferred local markets over distant markets. So, and you also have a case where, in some sense, some of the Mahila Umang FPO in Uttarakhand, they seem to prefer stability over growth. So there are some elements of women responding to markets very differently, but as Deborah says, we'll have to do much, much more work on it. Rohit, yeah, so Alexa, Francesco, and Deborah, you have an opportunity to question each other as well, or add to what has been. So it's kind of open. So two quick comments here. One is from Rohit. Rohit asks, have you seen any blended finance systems example in these FPOs? You can skip this question if you wish to. Vijay Shankar says, going forward from your presentation, are there instances of how the conflict between a professional management of the FPOs and the women members of the board is negotiated or handled? And, rightly, in fact, I was thinking, and Vijay says, Alexa, can you also answer this? Any tough question, Vijay, say, Alexa, can you answer it?
No, this is not my presentation currently, but I can fathom a guess of a chapter that I haven't written yet. I actually was going to ask a question similar to Deborah that is actually related to this. So I'm going to respond with a question, and then I'll think through also how I can answer. But I was wondering, I know I've heard this come up, how you have all seen how women respond differently. And I'm wondering how you tease apart the fact that, and there's a lot of factors of why that could happen. From my experience and or what I've seen, and perhaps yours as well, there's a lot of, because of all these barriers that women in these areas face, particularly women in rain-fed areas, particularly smaller farmer women, and NGO is very important for mobilizing. And there is this question, I think, that Vijay is speaking to about what is this relationship between those who are professionals and the women members, and that's an open conversation. And so I wonder sometimes with these responses to the market, how much you're seeing or thinking that this is partly the kind of NGO more of an NGO sort of initiative for various reasons that might be good, that an NGO decides to participate in these markets and not those markets. It also, my theory that I don't have full data on is that a lot of NGOs work in women's empowerment, they work in rain-fed areas among marginalized women. So it's a very intersectional question about which markets that you're looking at. It's not just a women thing that they just kind of decide to interact with, safer markets, but it's also the area, it would be a really difficult time going for cash crops. So anyway, so there's so many different factors. I'm wondering how you all tease them apart, because I think gender is part of it, and I wonder about how much these other things are happening. I'm going to ask that question, and I'll get back to Vijay's question with my answer.
Yes, Deborah, please go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think there can be an answer for this, because it's already there in your question that there's so many context dependent factors, and the relationship, I mean, again, I mean, here I'm mostly speculating, but, there is, at some time, there's this almost paternalistic kind of a view in the beginning, which might change and evolve over time when once there is, enough decision-making, power that is formed, then there could be also cases where women are, making decisions which may or may not be exactly in line with what was envisioned earlier, and that can change because of either newer information being available, newer markets opening up. I think that is also, I mean, that kind of negotiation is happening all the time. It's just that there are parts which are visible to us, and there are then other things which are again require you to require for us to understand the local markets more better, and also how are the priorities of let's say the promoting organizations also, that can change. I mean, basically none of these can be considered as static entities in that sense, because the incentives, let's say, that they have received from the CBBOs, or so that has also changed with time. So I think all of these again has to be taken on a case by case basis to really figure out how what really contributes to these connections changing. So I don't have a very clear answer. It's just that because it's complicated. So any kind of simplification, I think, will not do justice. So
yeah, thank you very much. There is a question by Devahuti, but I'm sure if you start answering it, it's going to take much longer. Devahuti is asking about issues of class or caste identities of women, and how does that affect decision making in the women-led FPOs. Let's wait for Alexa's PhD to come out. We may have more answers after that. So yeah, there's so many dimensions that we have to look at in terms of the theme of intersectionality and power, which is what we have been attempting in this track. So just to end, let me send it back to all the three speakers. And instead of me summarizing everything, so I'm going to give you 1 minute each to talk about your insights on the broad theme that we have had on power, inclusivity and intersectionality. You want to say, starting from Francesco and then Alexa and Deborah.
Well, so on the theme of inclusivity and intersectionality, I really want to, first of all, thank you, the two colleagues, Alexa and Deborah, for the great insights. But I want to restate again the fact that it's probably when the big picture, the big programs are shaped in a way that this topic can be addressed seriously, and there is some sensibility toward the topic of inclusivity and intersectionality, that probably it's not really only on the single person that join a project or lead a project to actually make so that these are included in the project management, but it's more of a comprehensive approach and more mainstreamed way of leading a particular type of development. So yeah, that's probably the main message I wanted to deliver with my presentation. But again, I'm very much aware that at the end of the day, it's really very much context related and project-based type of issue, the one of inclusivity and intersectionality.
Thanks, Francesco. Alexa?
Just, I guess, a couple of thoughts. I think this question of intersectionality is very important. I think that gender has become more and more part of the conversation. It needs to be more of the part of the conversation, especially because women are doing the bulk of this labor. But I think that the intersectional part actually gets dropped even more so. And I think this last question also on class and caste is incredibly important, because we generally actually aren't talking about just any women. We're talking about particularly lower caste and Adivasi women. And understanding that intersection, I think, is very important, because, I mean, just speaking on behalf of the kind of, or specifically about Adivasi women, is Adivasis come in at various points in kind of odd ways, but oftentimes they're sort of clumped together as smallholder farmers. And so I particularly think that there's something incredibly important to understand about the Adivasi and women intersection, because it speaks so much to all the kind of imaginaries, you can say, of what sustainable agriculture should be about, this sort of connection to the land, this sort of care for the land. And I think understanding that intersection is very important. And I think understanding the perspective of these farmers, of these marginalized women farmers, Adivasi farmers, or lower caste farmers as well, is important, because I think you get a lot of the complexities that I'm speaking about that are missed. I think I hear a lot, either, you know, we're trying to convince the farmers sustainable agriculture, or in other places people say, well, they just want to leave. And it's actually a much more nuanced, it's, you know, it's much more nuanced what we're doing. And I think, you know, like I said and alluded to, even the farmers themselves will acknowledge that, like, this is a good thing. Most farmers who are doing chemical agriculture say that would be great if we can do Jaivic Kheti, like, but we can't, you know. So it's, and I think that might even be actually a moment we're in that's turning. And so I think you're looking at these sort of power differentials, while also there's certain interesting commonalities that we have to understand as well, and take seriously what farmers aspire for in their own lives. So that's just a bit of a summary, but it will be more refined and nuanced in the next year.
Thanks a lot, Alexa. Deborah, your last minute.
Yeah, I think just Alexa's last sentence sort of really captured it, like what farmers aspire for, and whether these different vehicles in terms of farmer producer organizations, whether they're able to really address these complexities arising in terms of the power dynamics and the need for inclusive organizations and sustainable transitions, which is again, while largely accepted, the responsibility and you know, how it is really changing labor dynamics, and how to be able to really make it more enabling is something that needs a lot of thought at the policy level, as well as at the market level. And so the agency of the people involved, I mean, really how to place that at the center and create systems which are able to you know, make their voices heard, are, I think, something that we need to work towards, and that is only possible through you know, a lot of documentation and you know, detailed studies of the kind that Alexa is probably doing. So yeah.
Thank you very much, Deborah, Alexa, and Francesco, for a fascinating conversation today. You know, we couldn't have asked for a better start for the conference that's going to happen next week. And sorry, you'll all be missing it out, but we're going to have rich conversations. There are many speakers here who are presenters who will be joining us from the 16th to 18th. And we just as a, you know, from a conference organizing point of view, we also had an opportunity to test out how many papers can we have in 90 minutes. So just a reminder to all our friends who are going to present from 16 to 18, there are 4 papers in the 90 minutes. So you may not have as relaxed conversations as we probably have had today, but I'm sure there's enough time for us to carry on these conversations in the 3 days. And we really look forward to you know, hosting all of you, those of you who are coming to IRMA from 16 to 18. We will be having 2 parts of the, you know, the inaugural and valedictory, which will be streamed live. So we will share with all the conference participants the links so that you can join even if you're not in Anand on those dates. provided, of course, it's not at 2 a.m. in the morning for Alexa and others. But yeah, so thank you all very much. And thanks a lot to our participants from India who I think have been very patiently staying on. And I hope you all have a great dinner if you've not had it already. And look forward to seeing most of you in the next few days. Just to remind you that part of the theme, one of the themes in the conference is one that Shilpa is going to, kind of a panel which is on women and agriculture, which is hosted by Makam. We also have how do tribals look at agriculture, and that's something Vijay Shankar will be moderating the discussions. And we have 2 other conversations as well. So a lot to chew in the coming weeks, and we look forward to taking this momentum further. This video will be shared with all of you once we are able to edit it. And those of you who couldn't join could probably listen and follow up. Thank you all very much. And feel free to write to us at mst2023@irma.ac.in if you have any questions. Thanks a lot. Abhishek, maybe you can turn on your video and we can all have a group photograph. Unfortunately, we can't have one with, Viju and Shilpa and others, but yeah. So thanks to Abhishek, Anish, Shivansh, and others who have been providing the background support for making this happen. And yeah, so Alexa, have a good day. Francesco, thank you so much for sharing your ideas and insights. And we hope to continue to engage with some of the suggestions you made. And Deborah, welcome back to Anand, even if virtually. Bye for now.